James and Millicent Smith moved here to Kōloa in 1842, they had been on a very, very long journey. It took them about 4.5 months to sail from Boston all the way to Honolulu, and then after a couple of weeks they hopped on another boat and they came here to Kōloa Landing, in fact, right down the street, and they came to their new home. Back in those days, it took at least 2 or 3 days just to get to Honolulu, depending on ocean conditions and the weather. But James and Millicent had just gotten married that year, and they had committed at least a part of their lives to be missionaries to the Sandwich Islands. Little did they know that they would spend the rest of their lives right here in Kōloa, at this church, on this property here and next door, and living across the street, just across from Poipu Road. When they got here, they were welcomed by the Hawaiian people. And that doesn't mean that they always had a great relationship with no friction between the Smith family and the Hawaiians. In fact, we unfortunately know that James' son, who also became a medical doctor and moved back here, was murdered by a Hawaiian. But the Smith family never looked at what a few people did and blamed that on an entire race. The Hawaiian people welcomed them, and they had no idea as a people just how much they would be blessed by welcoming the Smith family and blessing them with their welcome. In 1853, just about 11 years after the Smiths had arrived, Dr. Smith, who was basically the doctor, the only Western-trained medical doctor for all of Kauai and Niihau, he knew that there were epidemics and that the Hawaiian people were dying. The population was decreasing significantly. In 1853 was the infamous smallpox epidemic, when thousands of Hawaiians throughout this island chain died because of smallpox. Dr. James Smith made it his personal mission to vaccinate every single person on Kauai and Niihau. When there were literally thousands of people dying on the other islands, there was only one death here. Partly because he was so committed to vaccinating everyone, but he also knew that as soon as somebody showed signs of smallpox, he quarantined them so that it wouldn't spread, just to make extra sure. Now, the Hawaiian people really had no idea just how they would be blessed by welcoming the Smiths into their midst. And the last couple of weeks, I've been reading the journals of James and Millicent Smith, and also some of the personal letters that they wrote and the letters that people wrote to them. They had 9 children, by the way, and 7 lived to adulthood. Many of them are buried at the cemetery just across the street and down a few houses here. But one of the things that just really impressed me about reading about the Smiths is how there was this Hawaiian sense of hospitality. When people showed up, you fed them. When people had needs, you provided for their needs. If somebody needed a place to sleep because it was raining, you would make space under your roof. And the Smiths also had that same mentality. When people showed up at Kōloa Landing, which was the main entry to the island of Kauai, back before Nauwili Harbor in Lihue had become more developed, people would come up what's now Poipu Road, and the Smiths would welcome them, they would feed them, invite them into their home for dinner. If they had any medical needs, Dr. Smith would attend to their medical needs, and on and on and on. In fact, as I read through the journals, everywhere Dr. Smith and his family went, people had that same kind of hospitality. He never had to worry about where he was going to stay. And, you know, we think of a pastor being very local. Dr. Smith, after he'd been here for I think less than 10 years, was not only the medical doctor for all of Kauai and Niihau, but he was the first person to be ordained in the Congregational Church. And his parish was not just here in Kōloa on this property. It went far to the west of here and all the way to Wailua.
Wow.
And every week he went to Lihue and held services there. And not quite as often, but fairly often he would go all the way up to the Kapa'a area. And he, in his journals, talked about how he had 3 divisions of this very large parish, which were in essence 3 separate parishes. But he was traveling on horseback and on foot constantly all along the South Shore and the East Shore. He also went to places like Waimea and visited out there and helped out there and in ministry as well as the medical profession. But he would also regularly with his family go up to Honolulu, and he would regularly go over to Niihau. And I'll just tell you from reading the journal, that was not a fun journey. Back then, they only traveled out there at night for the most part. And he often wrote about how very seasick he was by the time he arrived, but nevertheless, he saw to the medical needs of the people and their spiritual needs. His family, indeed, has been a great blessing in many, many ways to the Hawaiian people here. And as I was reading about the Kōloa plantation, as more and more people showed up from different parts of the world, like China and Japan, he and his family were committed to people's well-being, their health, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Many people lived because of him and his family. Well, today, for our Old Testament lesson, we read another story of hospitality where Abraham is sitting outside his tent where he lived in this place called Mamre, where it was known for the many oak trees and it provided a lot of shade. And so he's sitting there as an old man thinking about how wonderful life has been. He was close to 100 years old by that time. And all of a sudden, 3 visitors showed up. And we don't know exactly what they look like. He called them Lord. And we just assumed that he thought and knew from the start, well, that was God showing up. But when you read the text carefully, there's really no indication that he knew that he was actually hosting and visiting with somebody that may have been divine. He called them, my Lord, much in the same way that we would call a judge, your honor. But anyway, he showed them incredible hospitality. And he did so along with his wife Sarah because they knew what it was like to be on a journey. They absolutely knew what it was like to travel hundreds of miles on foot and be thirsty and hungry and tired and hot. In fact, we know from reading the previous chapters in Genesis that Sarah and Abraham went on at least 4 very, very long journeys in their life. When Abraham was much younger, he and his dad and his wife and his nephew Lot traveled from what is called Ur of the Chaldees, which is now very close to the tip of the Persian Gulf. It's in modern-day Iraq, not far from where Iran is today, the border of Iraq and Iran. And he basically, with his family, traveled all the way up to a place called Haran, on their way down to Canaan. It was 600 miles just to get from Ur to Haran. And that was about the halfway point before heading all the way down to Canaan. So most likely they traveled up the Euphrates River and they were going to rest in Haran for a while, and instead they decided to settle there. And then Terah, who was Abraham's dad, died. And God spoke to Abraham and to Sarah saying, now it's time for you to go to Canaan because I have a plan for you. And so here's Abraham, I think at the time he's 75 years old, and Sarah, and his nephew Lot. Lot's father had died much younger. They traveled all the way down, hundreds and hundreds of miles again, on foot, to the land of Canaan. And that's where they were going to settle, until there was a famine in the land, and then they traveled hundreds of miles down to Egypt, and stayed there for a while. Until the famine in the land was over, then they traveled hundreds of miles back to Canaan. So they knew what it was like to be in a long journey. They knew what their guests must have felt like. And so they threw a party for them. They brought water. They not only brought some food, they made the best meal that they possibly could. Sarah made bread out of the finest flour that they had. Abram went out and found the choicest of calves from all the cattle that he had. And they made cheese and served milk, and I'm imagining many, many other things. And so these guests that had been traveling, these strangers, these immigrants, or possibly refugees from other places, just showed up. And there was no question from Abraham or Sarah about, well, first let's talk about what religion you are. Or let's talk a little bit about your culture. Or before we welcome you into our space and even let you under our shade trees, we want to know that it's safe to have you here. There was none of that. In the story, it was just an immediate reaction when somebody is out traveling from a foreign land into your country. Of course you treat them hospitably. That's just what you do. And Abraham and Sarah knew that this wasn't just a command from God, it was a part of their identity. It was like built into their DNA. In fact, if you read earlier in Genesis, we are told that God loves the stranger. And God told Abraham and Sarah to love the stranger as well. And here's the beautiful verse for me. God told Abraham and Sarah that they would be a great nation in order to be a blessing to everyone else. And that all nations would be blessed because of them. In other words, Abraham and Sarah, even though there was just two of them at the time, they had no children yet between the two of them. They were a nation basically of two. But they thought of themselves as a nation who was blessed by God, and their role was to share the blessings and welcome the strangers. Well, little did they know that these three strangers that showed up at their door provided them for a blessing that just knocked their socks off. Okay, I know they didn't wear socks back then, but they're sandals, you know what I mean. So, Abraham and Sarah are offering the blessing of hospitality, and in return, one of these three strangers, these immigrants, these refugees from who knows where, says to them, I'm going to come back soon. And when I come back, Sarah will be holding a son in her arms. Now, Abraham had heard this story once before and laughed. And Sarah's on the other side of the tent laughing, probably hysterically. She's about 90 years old at the time. Abraham is just about 100 years old. And here's this total stranger telling them, you're going to have a son finally. You are no longer going to be a nation of two. You're going to be a nation of three. And they could hardly believe it. But the thing is, through that blessing, they had Isaac. And then Isaac, as a part of the blessing, had Jacob and the 12 sons of Israel from there. And it goes on, and lo and behold, it wasn't too long after that that there was an entire nation. That's what Abraham and Sarah had always wanted, and had probably given up hope by then. At least that it was going to turn out the way they had envisioned. But here are these people traveling through from a different country, certainly a different religion, a different culture, probably a different language, and all they did was bless them with their hospitality. And they were blessed more than the blessing they possibly ever could have given. I'm sure Abraham and Sarah later said, all we gave them was a meal, and we washed their feet and gave them water and let them under our oak trees for some shade. We got a nation. Who's the winner here? I have experienced over and over in my life that when I offer a blessing to someone, they often offer me back a blessing that's way more than I think I could ever give to them. Now, this theme of offering blessings and being blessed even more is a theme that goes throughout the entire Scriptures. We see it in the Old Testament, we see it in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and of course, the one that stands out to me the most out of all the stories of Jesus is the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, here's somebody traveling through, and it's the Samaritan, the foreigner, the person of a different religion, the person of a different culture, who blesses the person that's traveling through. And then, of course, the early church. The Apostle Paul told the Christians in Rome to extend hospitality to strangers. Over and over and over again, we see this throughout the Scriptures. And you know, the people that extend the hospitality are often the ones who receive the most back. Some of you have heard the story that I've shared before about this cross that I'm wearing. It's basically an amethyst cross wrapped in silver. And bear with me if you've heard the story before, but it's one of my favorite crosses, and those of you who attend regularly know that I have a nice collection of crosses. This is one that will always be held very dear to me, because when I was a pastor in the mountains of Utah, a homeless lady appeared in church one day. She saw us, I think she saw our church sign, and just decided to come to church and let us know that she was homeless. She lived in this old, beat-up, almost broken down van that I saw and thought, oh, this thing's just going to stop running any day. But do you know that our congregation welcomed her with open arms as if she was the wealthiest person in the world? It didn't matter to my congregation. And then later that Sunday, I was driving up near the shops in Park City, Utah, and there I saw this old, beat-up, broken-down van that was the only one, I'm sure, in the county that looked like that. So anyway, I saw this woman, Morgan, and I just approached her and asked her how she was doing, and you know, we just had a wonderful conversation, and then she came back to church again the next Sunday, and the next, and the next. And we actually had her over to our home for dinner a few times. And other people in the church reached out to her. It was just a beautiful extension of hospitality. It was just naturally who we were. And I love that about this particular church. And then one day, Morgan said, Alan, I want to show you something that's in the back of my van. And that kind of scared me. But anyway, we went out. She opened up the back. And on the bottom was a piece of old carpet. And underneath that was this piece of plywood that she had cut to fit the whole back of the van, and she pulled up the plywood, and underneath the entire floor of the van were buckets and boxes of crystals and precious, semi-precious gems. I couldn't believe it. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars worth of stones in the back of her van. And she told me, my passion in life is traveling around certain parts of the United States, hunting for crystals and semi-precious and precious stones. And then she had a box that was a little different from the rest. And in that, she had jewelry that she had made out of those stones. And one of those pieces of jewelry was this cross. And she gave it to me, and she just said, I want you to have this because you and your church have just extended such wonderful hospitality to me. You have been so kind. I can't remember the last time I felt such kindness by a community, and I was a complete stranger to you, and you just welcomed me as if I was the most important person in the world. I just have to tell you, I was shocked. I had no idea that she made jewelry. I had no idea that she had tens of thousands of dollars of precious stones in the back of this beat-up old van. But the message that I got from that is the message from today's Old Testament lesson, the message that we see woven throughout all of the scriptures. We bless people because that's who we are. It's a part of our DNA, and it doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter what religion they are. It doesn't matter what their culture is or what language we speak. As God's people, we welcome others. And do you know that they often bless us more than we can ever bless them? One of the things I love about Kōloa Union Church is your sense of hospitality. And that's part of your DNA, our DNA. It's been around all the way at least back to 1842. I know that from the reading that I've been doing the last couple of weeks. But I do remember that when I first was interviewing here, and when I came and said, this is who I am, and I just felt completely loved and welcomed and accepted for who I am. And I often hear from people who walk through our doors that that is the case for them as well. And then, just this year, when we became an official, open and affirming congregation of the United Church of Christ, we really put our actions into our beliefs by stating publicly, no matter who you are or where you've been on life's journey, you're welcome here. As I think about this message, I hope we're not just thinking, oh, we're going to be nice to people in order to get blessings from them. But I hope we will know that that's always the case. In fact, that's what's different between acts of grace and compassion and charity. Charity is when you're up here and somebody else is down here and you're always helping them because, of course, they don't have anything to give you. Acts of compassion and grace is when you see people at exactly the same level you are. You know that there's circumstances in life which may have caused them to not have as much as you, but we never treat people like we're up here and they're down here. Acts of grace and compassion. And like I said, we learned this from Abraham and Sarah and Jesus and the early church as well, is when we see each other all as equals, and we bless people because we know that they're going to bless us just by being in relationship with them. So I want to affirm you as a congregation for having hospitality and blessing in your DNA. And I want to encourage you to keep it up and know that that makes such a difference. And we do talk a lot these days about listening to the news and getting discouraged or knowing that there's stuff going on in this island that doesn't make us happy or actually makes us sad sometimes. When we have the attitude of hospitality, of compassion, and blessing others, that makes all the difference in the world. And I know that we will continue to be blessed because of it. Amen.